Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Debbie Ingalls. I'm the Director of CCOVI here at Brock University, and welcome to our second installment of the 2024 CCOVI Lecture Series. Our speaker today is my colleague and buddy, Dr. Gary Pickering. We started here at Brock, fairly close to each other. Gary is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and in psychology at Brock University. He's a researcher affiliated with CCOVI, and he's also a founding member of Brock's Environmental Sustainability Research Center. Gary is a stellar scientist. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed papers, conference proceedings, books, and is affiliated with numerous national and international research institutes. And this includes Charles Sturt University and the University of the Sunshine Coast, which are both located in Australia. His main research interests are primarily concerned with flavor science, enology, and the psychophysics of taste. And more recent projects have focused on the sustainability of viticulture and winemaking and its impact on consumer behavior. And I believe that's what his presentation is going to focus in on today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pickering for today's lecture.
Thank you, Debbie, for those kind words, and thank you for the opportunity to chat with you today. And I hope it will be a chat and interactive. We'll have time at the end for a discussion around my slides. So sustainability is the theme, and what I wanted to present was the results from a very preliminary trial that we completed last year, which hopefully will be the start of a larger program, funding permitting. Of course, profs don't do the work, it's always the students that do the hard work, so it's important to acknowledge them up front, in particular Maria Best. So most of what I'm talking about today is from Maria Best's honours project. She completed her honours project here, Enology and Viticulture, last year. Also Shannon Rusgers, who completed her Masters in Sustainability Science here at Brock, also last year, made some contributions. And our friend Belinda Kemp was on Maria's supervisory committee and has made some very helpful technical additions. So thanks to everyone. Why are we talking about sustainable wines? And what's the interest? Well, first of all, whether or not we like it or not, wine is not an inherently sustainable product. And for a really good review, Biano 3 years ago now, published a great document in sustainability, which I have if you wanted to follow up some of these items in more detail. But to summarise some of the key points from her review: very high water demands, even within the context of other agricultural products. Similarly to other horticultural and agricultural products, there's a high chemical load often on the environment, from fertilisers, from pesticides, fungicides and so on. These things result in reduced biodiversity, they result in soil infertility in many instances, and they do contribute to pollution in terms of our waterways, our lakes, rivers and so on. Energy demands are high, particularly in the winery, and in the case of fossil fuel, case of fuel source, there's significant greenhouse gas emissions from wine growing, winemaking. Not huge in the context of other agri-food products, but still present. I think our interest in sustainable wines has been renewed in the last several weeks. So one of, if not the major output from COP28 climate conference in November last year was their declaration to make agri-food sustainability the priority in the next several years, in recognition of its large contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And so work on grapes and wine, I think, falls really well within that mandate. In terms of the relative contributions of what we do with grape growing and what we do with winemaking, most of the greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, come post-harvest. around about 80% are from the winery and distribution phases. And of that, a large proportion of that is in fact from our use of glass bottles and the transportation, the energy cost involved in production, but particularly involved in transportation. We contribute waste, significant waste, and often much less visible is the social injustices in terms of sustainable or unsustainable wines. A good example was October, November, again last year. A lot of media coverage on alleged human rights abuses within the champagne industry in terms of illegal migrant and the treatment of migrant vineyard workers. And to my knowledge, there's 2 court cases currently working their way through the system. So there's the social sustainability side of winemaking that we need to address as well. Consumers are changing and changing rapidly. So particularly with younger demographics, but also with some older cohorts, sustainability is featuring more and more as one of the cues that consumers are using when it comes to purchase behaviour. What product category will I adopt, and what product within those categories will I purchase? So in a way we have not seen before, the sustainability of consumer goods is becoming an important driver for purchase behaviour in general. We know much less about wine, but we do for other consumer products. And from a top-down approach, I mean, most industry leaders and practitioners want to do things better, greener, and more sustainably, and also want to be able to meet this growing consumer demand for sustainable products. So that's the big framing of why we might be interested in sustainable wine production. What on earth is sustainable wine? There's as many definitions as there are technical reports out there, frankly. The FAO in the United Nations is probably the definition that is one of the more well-known, and as it relates to wine, it's very well presented in this graphic from BC, from Sustainable Wine Growing BC. Now, simply acknowledges or shows that it's not just environmental factors or dimensions that define a sustainable wine. For it to be truly sustainable, it has to incorporate economic and social measures and dimensions. And it's something that's probably missing. So we'll use that definition in terms of how we look at sustainable wine in this study and in this presentation. In recent years, we've seen lots of initiatives at industry and institutional level to try and get a handle on what sustainable wine means and how we can practice more sustainably. So with OIV recently, and I think very belatedly, but recently has incorporated sustainability principles into their protocols and recommendations and their policy plans for the next several decades. A much newer organisation based in the UK, Sustainable Wine Roundtable, in the last couple of years are working very hard with industry globally to try and develop a package of resources, but also a framework, as well as potentially a certification system, which will recognise all 3 dimensions of sustainability and give practitioners more of a guide, more of a structure, rather than this nebulous term sustainable. And much closer to home. For several years now, Sustainable Wine Growing Ontario and its counterpart in BC have had sustainable certification programs which are audited and are also developing resources for industry to help them become more sustainable. So overlaid, often neglected in these initiatives, is the sort of more basic question of, well, what about the consumers? They're the ones in the end who are making decisions about what they will or will not buy or drink. What are their perceptions of a sustainable wine? What are the barriers to them adopting more sustainable wine in their behaviours? And what opportunities are there for us in industry? So those simple questions really guided this study, and again I have to emphasise it's just a pilot preliminary study. that was going after these 4 questions. So for Canadian consumers, what are their current perceptions and understanding of sustainable wines? What is the knowledge base? How much do they know? How much do they want to know? Is sustainability even important to them? We know it's a motivator for purchase decisions with other consumer products, everything from fashion through to food. Maybe it's not important for wine consumers. And if it is, what are the characteristics of those who are most engaged with sustainable wine? If we know that, that can help with segmenting the marketplace, it can help with marketing, advertising, promotional initiatives. Currently, what are consumers doing around sustainable wine? Are they buying them? If so, how much? And what proportion of their total wine intake could be considered sustainable wine? What are the factors that predict that engagement? And we know, for instance, the social demographic characteristics of people that are perhaps not engaged in sustainable wine. That provides actionable information for industry in terms of trying to move them through into making more sustainable wine purchases. And part of that question is, what is the potential in terms of moving the dial, in terms of getting consumers more engaged with these products, buying more? Have we saturated the market already? Is there potential for growth? What is that potential? And we can't get much more than a surface understanding from a 10-minute survey, which is what this research is based on, but we can at least get a sense of where the answers might lie to these questions. So in terms of the general design of the study, it was, as I've said, just a 10-minute survey. It was conducted in 2022. We used Dynata, an online marketing company, to provide us access to Canadian wine consumers. An ultimate sample, we used 725 of the responses. We targeted and got a representative sample in terms of gender from across the country, in terms of provincial representation that matches the census, in terms of household income. Our particular sample is slightly more educated than the average Canadian adult, and our age is slightly higher, 42.3 I think is the average Canadian age. For adults, ours was 47. So we can be confident, somewhat confident, that our results probably do apply and can be extrapolated to all Canadian wine consumers. So that first question, what are current perceptions and understandings around sustainable wine? Here's what we did. So first of all, we scanned the literature and pulled out cues or motivators for purchase that we know apply to wines in general from dozens of studies. Things like price and quality, and value and quality and so on. And we also added some sustainability cues and had consumers rate the relative importance of this list of purchase motivators or cues. So we can see where, if at all, sustainability features relative to other cues. We then asked consumers, we gave them an open response question, so no prompting, no cues, no priming, just simply, what do you understand of a sustainable wine? What does it mean to you? So they used freeform to complete that question. And then we used standard inductive coding techniques to try and derive and quantify the main themes that came out of that analysis. We then prompted them with characteristics of sustainable wines that we knew from the literature applied to other countries to see how relevant they were to Canadian wine consumers. And so that was simply a check all that apply question. Of these following 24 items, which do you think are characteristic of sustainable wines? And so those items covered several categories: price, quality, ingredients, health, environmental dimensions. And again, we were curious as to what the characteristics were of those who were most involved with sustainable wine. So we measured sustainable wine involvement and also general wine involvement, which is basically the average score across their interest in the product, their knowledge of the product, and how often they purchase the product. It gives us an average score, and we can measure involvement that way. Okay, so what we find for that first question. So what we have here for all consumers is the average ratings on an importance scale. How important are the following factors when you make a purchase decision? From not important at all through to extremely important. All we can see is the top three there. Quality, taste expectation, and price were the dominant motivators, or self-reported motivators, for why they buy a particular wine over another. Nothing particularly surprising there. We've seen that with other Canadian studies we've conducted. Often price is higher than what it was for this cohort, but that's pretty standard, not just in Canada, but throughout wine drinking regions. This is a little bit surprising that sweetness rating was somewhere between important and very important for this cohort. However, the three Qs that signal sustainability, certified sustainable, certified organic, and certified biodynamic, were amongst the lowest in terms of the ratings of consumers, in terms of how important these are. They still have some importance. These scores all fall between somewhat important and important, but relative to other Qs, they are much lower. So that's interesting. Ugly slide, followed by several other ugly slides, but I'll try and walk us all through it. So that second question was open response. What does a sustainable wine mean to you? Thematic analysis after inductive coding, yada yada, to pull out the dominant themes. Again, important to stress, there's no prompting at all. Respondents had no prior information, so as we wouldn't bias them. These are listed in from the most prevalent themes cited down to the least prevalent themes cited. Right, so up top, first and foremost, and probably of no surprise, environmental related themes were the dominant ones cited by consumers. Sustainable wine is most related to environmental themes. So simple statements like one that doesn't impact the environment would be a typical response received. Second most prominent theme, dunno. Literally, dunno was a common answer. I have no idea. Any response that reflected that idea was coded as no understanding. That's interesting. And straight away, one can look at some managerial implications of this lack of knowledge. Next most common response was sustainable production. So it's not particularly helpful. Simply, if someone referenced the word sustainable in their answer and it got dumped in here, typically there was no further information provided, so it doesn't provide much in the way of extra insights other than it was related to production of the wine as opposed to, let's say, transport. And before we start to get a big drop-off in citation frequencies, this theme of reduce, renew, and recycle was the next most prevalent theme. And reflect on that, it's perhaps not surprising. So both in terms of the general media, but also community-based initiatives like the Green Bin program and so on, we're pretty much exposed to this idea when we think about sustainability of reduce, renew, and recycle. So to see it reflected in the wine consumers' perceptions of sustainable wines is perhaps not surprising. So remember, the UN definition, and most definitions of sustainability, incorporate social and economic dimensions. Well, these were cited by respondents, but very low frequency. They're just not that salient for Canadian wine consumers when they're thinking about sustainable wine. They're thinking about environmental aspects of sustainability. At least that's what the results show so far. So remember, we then gave consumers a list of 25, I think, items that were characteristic of sustainable wine and research that's been conducted elsewhere, and asked them to simply tick if they agree that this is important. And then we grouped these after the fact into categories. The respondents didn't see this information. Makes it somewhat easier to make sense of it. So let's dive into those four figures. First of all, the environmental considerations were cited much more frequently than anything else, reinforcing what we saw in that open response question. So, sustainable wines help protect the environment. They're packaged in environmentally friendly ways. They reduce greenhouse gas emissions, were the dominant attitudes reflected. Now, most wine in Canada is packaged in glass bottles, which I tell you is not particularly environmentally friendly for a whole bunch of reasons. But because for other bottles they can be recycled, perhaps that's an erroneous perception from consumers, because glass is not. At least the way we currently use glass in the industry, particularly sustainable. Interesting that the number of people that cited sustainable wine as organic or as biodynamic was quite low. It's just over 30% for organic and about 14% for biodynamic. What does that mean? Well, it means that sustainable wine is not synonymous with being organic or being biodynamic for wine consumers. In fact, there's quite a distinction there in those citation rates. So people are thinking about sustainable wine differently, or conceptualising it as being something, a different beast than an organic wine or a biodynamic wine. In terms of economic and social considerations, again, as we saw with the open response question, these dimensions are not as frequently endorsed or cited as environmental. But over a third of consumers think that a sustainable wine has been made by a more responsible winemaker, and that it has, and production has a respect for ethical issues, so that they are being acknowledged. And also they believe that a sustainable wine reduces transportation and packaging costs. That's reflecting an awareness of an economic dimension of sustainable wines. And lastly, ingredient and personal health considerations. Again, not a lot of endorsement for these characteristics. But over a third of respondents think that a sustainable wine is transparent about the origins of raw material that are used to make that wine. So some of these results agree with consumers in other countries, others do not. And this is one slide in which the ingredient and personal health side is often a lot more important to European consumers. I'll tell a lie, this is the last one. So, price, taste and quality considerations, essentially not very salient for consumers. They're not citing these very often. But that's interesting, because think back to the very first slide. The three most dominant purchase motivators for wine in general, by a big margin, are price, taste and quality. And yet when consumers are reflecting on sustainable wine, price, taste and quality are not featuring high in their definition or understanding of a sustainable wine. I think the good news there is that this is the marketing potential in terms of promotion and positioning of sustainable wines. Currently, they're rated low when people think about sustainable wines, but we know in general these are very dominant motivators. So I think there's some targets there for wine marketers. Okay, so we're interested in understanding, well, what are the characteristics of those who are just not into sustainable wine versus those who are very much into the wine. So we just took it by modal distribution. Probably didn't. I tell a lie, I'm sure what we did now. But we did characterise people into being low or high indulgence in sustainable wine, and tried to see if there was any segmentation possibilities there in terms of their characteristics. So again, the sustainability, the wine involvement measure is the average score for your interest in the product, your self-rated knowledge of the product, and how frequently you purchase the product. And the significance here, if it's got an asterisk, it means that particular attribute or factor did differentiate, did differ between low and high involved consumers. So first of all, no gender or no provincial differences. The provincial result may or may not be surprising. The gender one it does contrast with what many European studies have found. Everything else being equal, girls are much better than boys when it comes to anything to do with green behaviour, pro-environmental actions and intentions, and purchase behaviour. It's one of the truisms in sustainability science. Do not see evidence of that in this cohort. Males and females were equally likely to be high and low engagers with sustainable wines. And we've got some other data that reinforces this finding. So that's interesting. If nothing else, there's not much point in promoting or marketing the product based on gender differences, on what sort of magazines one gender might read, for instance. You're not going to get much bang for your buck out of that. There was an age result such that those who are more highly involved in sustainable wines were were younger than low involvement. That's consistent with what many other wine regions have found. And it's consistent with the greater engagement with sustainability, the greater valuing of that with other consumer products. There's a but here. We'll look at the but in a minute. But this is just simply self-reported behaviour. How are you into sustainable wines? What are your attitudes towards them? What's your knowledge base? These are subjective judgments. There was an education effect such that you're more likely to be a low involvement consumer if your highest attainment was high score or less. There was no household income effect, which I think several people were surprised by that result. Income does not predict whether or not you're more or less likely to be a high involved consumer. As we'd expected, we did see a general wine involvement effect. So essentially, the more you're into wine in general, both in terms of your interest and your knowledge and how much you drink, the more likely you'll be into sustainable wine. And that's reflected in other things that associate with wine involvement, like how frequently you purchase wine, how much you spend on wine. It's higher for those that are into sustainable wine. None of this is really that surprising, but it's, from a price point perspective, it's interesting to know that these folks are willing to, or do report paying, more than $5 a bottle extra for wine. How does that relate to, and the sustainable wine result is just what we would expect. By definition, if you're more highly involved in sustainable wine, you're going to buy it more frequently. But I think what's interesting is these last two results, is that those who are more highly involved in wine will also pay more for sustainable wine, around about $5 more. But what's interesting is the premium's no higher. That is, the percentage, or the amount above and beyond what you would pay for a general wine is no different between the two cohorts. There's no more premium in targeting the high involvement or the low involvement group. Proportionally, there's no difference in what they will pay for the product. So there's some preliminary stuff in there that I think helps to inform questions around price point, which I know is one of the big issues that industry is struggling with. Not just making sustainable wine more affordable, but also what the market sensitivity, what the optimum pricing is from a consumer perspective around the products. Right, so the next question, we'll finish with this question. We looked at the importance of purchase cues or purchase motivators to see if they would differ as a function of how much you are into sustainable wine. So the red bars are those that have high involvement, and the blue bars are those that have low involvement. What you can see, with one exception, for any purchase cue or motivator, highly involved consumers rate that cue as being more important. Maybe not that surprising, but there are some relative differences that I think are important. Quality indicators. So all these measures here, like quality is really important to me when I buy a wine, quality scores, the awards on a label, the quality statements on a label, proportionally they are actually more important for high sustainable wine consumers. And we'll speak to more about that shortly. So I think that's an interesting point of differentiation. And price is the one thing that was not different. So both high and low sustainable wine consumers value price equally, even though one's paying more than the other. Okay, so the next question was, where are people at now in terms of their engagement with sustainable wine? We took 8 measures from the literature, 8 different sorts of behaviours. Most research, including Canadian research to date, is almost exclusively focused on organic wine. Simply polling consumers about their organic wine perceptions and simply how likely are they to purchase the product and how likely are they to pay extra for the product. We went beyond that and asked about 8 different sustainable wine behaviours. The response options, and I'll explain these more shortly, were these. So folks, for each of those 8 behaviours I'm jumping ahead of myself. Here's an example of the 8 sustainable wine behaviours. When there's a choice, I choose the wine that impacts the environment the least. I avoid buying wines from companies that I know do not respect working conditions and so on. That's the 8 questions. The response options, which I'll talk about shortly, were these. You either tick a box that says, I'm not doing this, I'm not willing to, I would like to do this, but don't know how. I would like to do this, and I already know how, and I'm already doing this. They're pulled from a theory called the trans-theoretical model, which I'll very briefly talk about in the next slide. And we also measured wine involvement as described previously. Sorry, only theory slide I'll present today, I promise. Rather than just asking simple questions like, well, I'm doing this, or I'm not doing this, okay? The trans-theoretical model suggests that human behaviour and decision-making is much more complex than that. And it positions that within a change cycle. This originally came from the health field, where researchers were looking at behaviours such as stopping smoking or reducing my weight, changing my eating behaviour to reduce obesity. But we've been using it the last several years looking at pro-environmental behaviours, and I think it's really valuable. Essentially, the idea is that, well, there's a loose cycle that goes like this. There's a behaviour that we're not going to engage in. It might simply be we're not aware that is a behavioural choice, or it might be we have attitudinal barriers. That's the silly thing to do, I'm never going to do that. Whatever, that's called pre-contemplation. The next step or stage is called contemplation. For whatever reason, the consumer has changed their thinking to, yes, I want to engage with that behaviour, but I've got no idea how I do that, where I start. The preparation stage is the idea that, yes, I want to do this behaviour and I know what to do. Action stage, I'm doing it. As with many human behaviours, there's often a maintenance stage in which we're asking ourselves questions about, do I continue doing this behaviour or not? If I don't, then the cycle can kick back in again. And we can enter, and we do enter or exit that cycle at any stage. Now, why it's interesting, apart from the fact that I think it better represents the complexities of human behaviour, is that depending upon what stage you are at as an individual or where a population is at, there's different interventions that make better sense to try and move you through to the next stage. The stage here might simply be educational campaigns focused on just making folks aware that there's this alternative behaviour. In the contemplation stage, you're already saying, yep, I want to do it, but no idea how. So again, if we stick with education as the example, it's more context-specific information you need to tell people. I think a good example, a silly example might be, okay, I'm now committed to buying an electric car. So information in terms of local dealerships, in terms of where the recharge facilities are and mileage and all that sort of stuff helps to move them from the contemplation stage into the preparation stage. Preparation stage, yep, I'm there, I want to do it, I know how, but you're still not doing it. So interventions called nudging are often the best type to move them through to the action stage. Anyway, I think it's interesting from that perspective, from a marketing, from a social engineering perspective, if we know where a population or a demographic is within the cycle. And it hasn't been applied to wine before. Or hadn't. Right, where are we? Sorry, I actually lost my place. There we are. Good stuff. Okay, so this is the proportional response for all 8 behaviours. So these are the 8 sustainable wine behaviours. This is the proportion for each behaviour who are in the different stages. You know, red, no, I'm not going to do it, all the way through to green, I'm already doing this. Really important slide. What can we see? Well, we can see that the colour that is most prevalent is orange. So the most common response for any of these 8 behaviours is, I would like to do this, but I don't know where to start. In other words, there's a huge educational opportunity and challenge for us if we want to promote sustainable wine. Related to that, you combine the orange and yellow bars together, by far and away, that's the most predominant response. These are called the change stages. People aren't stuck in pre-contemplation, they're not currently doing the behaviour, they're in a change stage. That's really exciting news, I think, when it comes to the capacity the potential of sustainable wines here in Canada. In terms of action stage, most are not engaged currently with these products, the exception being where possible I buy wines packaged in reusable or recycling containers. It's a bit of a red herring because here in Canada, I mean, glass bottles are about the only thing, more or less, that wines are packaged in. So I wouldn't put too much weight on that. In terms of the red response, I'm not doing this, and there's no way in hell I'm going to. We can see the most prevalent is for these 2 behaviours here. I pay more for socially responsible wine when there's an alternative. I pay more for environmentally friendly wine, even when there's a cheaper alternative. So that's telling us that consumers, or at least a segment of consumers, are particularly price sensitive when it comes to sustainable wine, which probably won't be a surprise to current producers. At least we have some data now to back that up. Right, so what factors predict engagement? To answer this question, we used the same questions that had already been determined from the previous slides. We did an initial correlation analysis to help decide what factors to include in a fancy regression model later on. And we kept out several factors because they were not related to the likelihood of you being in an action stage or in an inaction stage. Some of these were surprising. So again, gender made no difference. Whether or not you are not performing the behaviour or you're intending to, gender was not a predictor. Nor was province, nor was education, nor was household income, nor was the importance of price. These things were not related to your action stage. The other stuff that was used in a regression model. And the cool thing about the regression model that we use is that you can determine, first of all, regression allows you to determine the effect of one factor while accounting for others. So we could account, for instance, well, not in this example, but we know that there's almost always a gender differences, except in this study. So we could determine the importance or the relevance of your gender, also accounting for, let's say, income differences at the same time, because typically women earn less than males. So that's the advantage of doing a regression analysis. The second advantage in the model that we used is that in the same analysis you can simultaneously determine what drives action and what drives inaction. So when you think about it, those things that motivate me to do something could be different to those factors that motivate me not to do something. And so you can simultaneously work out what factors are driving both of those action stages or inaction stages. So, I know this is horrible, and I'll try and break it down. First of all, these are the 8 behaviours again. The A stands for action, the PC stands for pre-contemplation. That's basically it. I'm not going to do it. These are the things that were predictive, and so those are the factors that we looked at more closely. An asterisk means that that was a strong predictor for that particular behaviour. If it's positive, it means it had a positive effect. If it's negative, it means it had a negative effect. That's the beta values. So let's break it down a little bit more, if we can. Or rather, I'll simplify things. Of all the things we looked at, again, we've dropped off a whole bunch of demographic variables because they weren't important. Perhaps not surprisingly, the importance one places on sustainability cues was the strongest predictor. A positive predictor for being in the action stage. And if this wasn't important to you at all when you purchased wine, it predicted you, say, being in the pre-contemplation stage. So there's not much surprise there, but it was consistent across all behaviours. Wine involvement was important for several behaviours. So it positively predicted being in the action stage for when there's a choice, I choose those less environmentally harmful wines. If I understand the potential damage, I don't purchase the product. And also through the social and economic behaviours. If you have a high level of overall wine involvement, if you're into wine in general, you're more likely to be in the action stage for the sustainable wine factors. Oh, interesting. So at one level, what's taste got to do with anything in terms of sustainability? But both the importance of taste or your anticipation of what a wine would taste like, and also how important quality is to you when you make a purchase. Both of these were predictive for some of the sustainable wine behaviours. This quality theme comes up in other ways as well as data I haven't shown. And age. Age crops up for 3 behaviours, but not in the direction that we would predict from what we saw earlier. Remember, those who are most into sustainable wines, self-reported, tended to be younger. Yet when you actually break that down to specific behaviours, it's actually older people that are more likely to be engaged, at least in these 3 behaviours. So there's a mismatch between the two. Maybe it's simply aspirational. Younger people think that they should and report being more into sustainable wine, but they're not in terms of their behaviours. And that might be things like price barriers, because sustainable wines are more expensive. It's an interesting result. Right, last question we asked was, what's the potential for moving the dial? Is there much? Should we be interested in promoting these products in our industry? I think the result of my conclusions from the submitted study are mixed, but mainly yes, we should be. What argues against this is that we saw from that very first result that sustainability cues are not very important compared to other cues for local wine consumers at the moment. However, we just saw this slide. The vast majority of consumers are orange or yellow. They are in a change stage in terms of their self-report, that they do intend or do want to engage in these behaviours. That result alone, I think, should give us much confidence in moving forward. And most consumers indicate they are happy to pay more for environmentally friendly and socially responsible wine. Well, that remains to be determined with actual behaviour, but they're reporting that they are willing to do so. We haven't got enough data to comment on what the sweet spot is in terms of price sensitivity and optimum pricing. That is part of future work we would like to do. And I think the other piece of really good news for this question is that, price aside, again, the jury is still out on that, that the most salient barriers to people adopting these behaviours is actionable. It's knowledge. They're saying so themselves. That we're not quite sure. We're not quite sure what a sustainable wine is, but we're not quite sure what are the cues that will tell me in a purchase environment that this wine is more sustainable than that wine. That's extremely actionable information. So that's an exciting result, I think. Right, conclusion, summary. First of all, as we've alluded to several times, sustainability cues are significantly less important than almost everything else for consumers as a purchase motivator. The concept of what is a sustainable wine looks to be more fuzzy and less clear for wine consumers compared to what we know of consumers for other agri-food products. What we do know is the environmental dimensions are much more salient at the moment for wine consumers than the social or economic dimensions. And 22% of responders indicate they have no or very limited knowledge of, or understanding, I should say, of what a sustainable wine is. There are some characteristics that look clear in terms of those who are most engaged with this product. They're better educated, they're more wine involved generally, and they spend significantly more per bottle. As we've mentioned several times, the vast majority of consumers are in a change stage when it comes to their intentions towards sustainable wine. Wine involvement consistently is predictive of and strongly predictive of your sustainable wine behaviour. That's got implications for where and to whom we market these products to. And age and importance of both taste expectation and perceived quality also predict several sustainable wine behaviours. So what? In terms of implications and recommendations, I think in the big picture, this and related work suggests we need to get together as an industry, or as a stakeholder community, and be generating clear, integrated and consistent communication about both sustainability characteristics of our wines and also initiatives that help carry that message. We need to get our act together on the promotional, educational front. It needs to be clear and consistent messaging. Certification, a robust certification system is going to be important, but it's not going to be sufficient in my view, and that's important to note. Certification, the label on the bottle, is going to help with that quick, easy cue for consumers to see, oh, this wine looks as though it's going to be more sustainable than that wine. But it needs to be concurrent education and working out which are the key sustainability characteristics that you're more likely to pay money for. Is it some vineyard practice? Is it a winery practice? Is it the social cues, how we treat migrant workers and so on? Now let's work out what the pertinent cues are to try and promote this behaviour. Got to be careful. The market, and particularly the younger generation, are absolutely sick of greenwashing, so our initiatives have to be authentic, robust, auditable, and everything else. I haven't shown all the data we have on this, so don't believe it yet, but absolutely convinced that quality messaging is key. In fact, some work from Europe, from European consumers would confirm this. On the whole, people are not going to buy consumable, sustainable wines unless they think the quality is the same or better than conventionally produced wine. Can't reinforce that enough. So our messaging has to contain reassurances about the quality of the wine. It is key for sustainable wine, I think. Global standards, such as what the Sustainable Wine Roundtable are currently building, I think will also help with that perceived integrity and certification system. And I'm told that both Ontario and BC are working together to try and form an integrated and common certification and maybe even logo system for designating sustainable wines, and that's fantastic. I think we've got some baseline data now for the average Canadian wine consumer that we can use to track how engagement might change over time and how successful or not different interventions might be. I also think from an academic perspective that the trans-theoretical model is a really interesting way to capture the nuances of consumer behaviour around wine. And further research. Dollars. I'm keen to do more work. The Ontario Grape and Wine Research Inc. haven't been overly enthusiastic about related projects in the past. Perhaps my projects are not enthusiastic about, I'm not sure. But I'm going to do one last kick at the can as part of a large team collaboration involving many CCOVI researchers, University of British Columbia, several universities and research groups across the country have all formed a consortium and just put in an application to a new fund called Alliance, geared around net zero wine. And a small part of that project that I am leading, if it gets funded, is around consumer perceptions of low carbon wine. And very excited to be partnering with Ontario Craft Wineries and Stratas as two partners who are going to support this work if it gets funded. And again, I'm just talking about the consumer part of this project. We'll do more work with consumer perceptions. Surveys are limited. We'll be doing focus groups and using other methods to dive much deeper into what the attitudes and barriers are for consumer adoption of these wines. And in particular, we'll focus a lot on messaging. What's the optimum way to message, be it wine labels, be it social media posts, be it articles, whatever. What's the best way to message, to frame information about sustainability, to engage the consumer? And in particular, we're going to use some economic models to go after the question, where is that sweet spot in terms of pricing? What can the market bear? And what are the characteristics of the different segments in the marketplace in terms of the premium that we can extract from sustainable wines? So very excited about that possibility. Don't believe anything you hear on this podium unless it's been through the peer review process or something similar. Most of what I've told you is likely kosher, but it's just been published in these two journals. I've got copies if you are interested at all and follow up in more detail. I'm more than happy to send you copies. if your motivation as a wine producer is to do the right thing in terms of being more sustainable, then there's no need to, that's the only motivation, why promote or advertise it, other than to perhaps for it to be an example or a model for other industry members. But most of us can't afford that, or if we see an opportunity for a premium or to simply make up the added costs of being truly sustainable, then we need consumers to be on board and likely to be paying a premium for that. So I think it comes down to what the main motivators are for that winery and adopting more greener practices. There's one interesting, thorny thing within that answer, and that may explain why some wineries, I say wineries, I'm talking about vineyards too, the whole process, are somewhat reluctant to advertise their practices. And that's inferred by that quality result that I showed you, that I don't think every producer is confident that sustainably produced wines are seen by many consumers as being of equal quality. We've given some examples of other wine styles, but I'll get into trouble. So there might be a reluctance on this producer, and they may be correct in their concerns that if I market this whole hog as being made from sustainable grapes, sustainable techniques, there might be an implied association with a lower quality product, because perhaps the mere absence of information saying this tastes like peach and dog and whatever other ways we confer quality on our labels, almost by definition is missing, because it needs space to promote the sustainability dimensions. So I'm not sure how much of that is a driver. But I suspect for most producers are not economically in a situation where they can afford just to do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, that they need consumer buy-in, and absolutely that we've got to promote that. I think it's not just an individual producer issue, it's very much an industry-wide initiative if we're going to get it right.
Any questions? Here I have a question. A little outside of what you presented today, but maybe the next step in converting, consumers to more sustainable wines. You mentioned in your talk the least sustainable packaging is glass wine bottles, right? For a number of different reasons. If wineries, could prove equal quality in another kind of packaging, what sort of barriers, given all those factors that we presented today, would there be to the consumer, to switch to a Tetra Pak version of wine versus, in the wine bottle, knowing that second packaging is leading to more sustainable production, overall. And and the second part of this is, would it take like an industry leader to make that jump, that consumers are going to buy that wine no matter what packaging it's in, for other consumers and other producers to then follow?
Great questions. I'll probably forget most of them, so do that. On that first one, I think it's extremely well established that there is still huge consumer pushback on alternative packaging to glass due to perceived inferior product. I mean, that's just a truism. We've been quite slow, I think, in Canada in changing consumer attitudes around this, but it still is not true for all demographics, but it's still true. And give me something other than the glass bottle. I find myself doing this. It's like, it's a bit dodgy. What's the quality going to be like? So we're fighting against that as a current barrier.
Kind of like, cork and screw.
Exactly. And I was going to use that example to answer the second question. The other part of that is the concurrent consumer perception around glass. So there'll be a pushback because, well, it's not glass, so dodgy character, dodgy quality. But currently consumers think glass is the bee's knees in terms of wine packaging, in terms of being environmentally friendly.
Right.
Okay? And it ain't. Right. It really isn't. And there's so many papers out there, and one came out last week from AWRI in Australia. quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions from your typical glass bottle. We're doing great things in Ontario. The LCBO with its light bottle program has been a world leader. So we're doing good things, but we're not reusing bottles, for instance, would make a huge difference. Italy's doing some preliminary work now at the logistics of reusing bottles, quite a cycling, recycling, and there's some cool stuff happening. But at the moment, you're fighting against consumer perception that anything other than glass is going to be an environmentally, dodgy thing. And the industry leader, the first past the post idea, I think we saw that with best examples in Australia with the adoption of screw caps as alternative closures. Massive pessimism and pushback at the start, and yet now it's the norm in so much of the Western, of the New World anyway. And all the evidence says there are no quality concerns. Now, good questions. Thank you.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, please join me in thanking Gary for a small portion of our appreciation, Gary. And just a reminder that next week we'll welcome Dr. Viet Vasseur, who's a professor of biological and environmental sciences here at Brock. And her lecture will explore the science surrounding cover crops and vineyards and whether commercial, native, exotic, or none at all is the best path forward for cover crops. So we look forward to seeing you all next week, same place, same time. Thanks.